A widow's heart beats strongest when her land is at stake. In 1880, Wyoming, Maggie Carver, scarred by loss, fights to save her family's spring from the iron grip of a ruthless railroad. A stranger's arrival, dust-worn and hiding a past, sparks a battle that could redeem or ruin them both. Will Maggie's defiance forge a new future, or will the tracks of progress crush her hope? Subscribe now to follow their journey and share where you're listening from. Every voice adds to this tale. What secrets does the stranger carry? Can justice prevail in a land of dust and greed? Stay with us to uncover the truth. The Wyoming wind tore across the plain like a thief, rattling the warped boards of Maggie Carver's barn and carrying a chill that bit deeper than any October evening should. At 35, Maggie was a widow forged by loss, her husband's blood long soaked into the earth after a clash with outlaws 3 summers past. Her hands, calloused from wrestling the land, gripped the pump handle by the old well. Each creak of the rusted gears mocked her, spitting grudging trickles of water into the tin bucket below. The tax notice in her apron pocket, $40 due in 14 days, felt heavier than the iron she pumped. Pay, or the county would claim her spring, the heart of her family's land, for the railroad's iron tracks. She worked the handle, muscles taut, her breath fogging in the dusk. The sagebrush hissed, and the distant howl of a coyote cut through the quiet. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, caught a shadow where none belonged, near the split rail fence, just beyond the barn's sagging silhouette. Her hand slid to the knife at her belt, the blade worn smooth from years of skinning and survival. "Show yourself," she called, voice hard as flint, steady despite the pulse hammering in her throat. A figure stepped from the gloom. Dust coated his long coat, clinging to the brim of a hat tilted low. Beside him, a sway-backed mare snorted, ribs stark under its sweat-streaked hide. The man's hands stayed open, palms out, no threat in his stance. "Sam Houston," he said, voice low, scraped raw by miles. "Just need water and a corner to sleep. Me and the horse'll be gone by dawn." His eyes, shadowed under the hat, held hers, tired, but not shifty. Maggie studied him, her grip on the knife easing but not releasing. The mare's head hung low, and the man's boots were caked with the red dirt of a long trail. No gun belt, no swagger. "Mang nuochokia," she said, nodding toward the trough. "Yen mach trong chuang, keep it clean. There's bean stew in the house. You eat by the fire." She turned, her boots crunching on the dry earth, but paused. "Don't touch the harness wall. Gate swings both ways, but only on my say." The windmill's blades groaned overhead, catching the last light as the sun bled red over the horizon. Maggie crossed the yard to the house, the tax notice crinkling with every step. Inside, the kitchen smelled of pinto beans and cornbread, the pot simmering low on the cast-iron stove. She ladled stew into a tin kettle, wrapped a heel of cornbread in a clean rag, and carried it out. Sam had tethered his horse to the trough, pouring water from a dented canteen with care, like a man who knew the cost of every drop. He'd swept the barn floor clean, straw piled neat in the corner. No mess, no fuss. She set the kettle on an upturned crate by the fire pit, sparks snapping in the evening air. "Dippers in the bucket. Take what you need, no more." Sam nodded, tipping his hat without flourish. "Obliged, ma'am." He took a tin bowl, waiting until the horse had its fill before filling his own. Maggie watched, arms crossed, as he ate in silence, the firelight carving deep lines in his face. Hunger like his didn't waste words. A glint caught her eye, a silver chain at his collar, a pendant tucked beneath his shirt. Not a cowboy's trinket, too fine for a drifter. "Pump's been limping?" he asked, glancing at the well, its frame leaning like a tired old man. "Always," Maggie said, voice flat. "Groans like a mule with a stone in its shoe." Sam's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Could take a look. No charge, just a roof till sunup." Men offering help always wanted something. Land, favors, or worse. Maggie's eyes narrowed. Not tonight. She gathered the empty kettle, the fire's warmth fading as she crossed back to the house. Inside, she set the dishes in the pan, the tax notice burning in her pocket. She pulled it out, the words stark in the lamplight. $40. 2 weeks. Spring as collateral. Beyond the window, the barn's lantern glowed steadily. Sam's shadow moved once, tending his horse, then stilled. The windmill clicked, missed, clicked again. For a moment, the place didn't feel so hollow. Maggie blew out the lamp, the dark settling like dust. She latched the door, the weight of the fight ahead heavier than the Wyoming night. The Wyoming night clamped down hard, stars pricking the sky like spurs glinting on a rider's boot. Maggie Carver stood in the kitchen, the lamplight casting her shadow long across the scrubbed pine table. The tax notice lay under a chipped sugar tin, its words, $40, 2 weeks, spring as collateral, etched in her mind, sharper than a branding iron. Outside, the fire pit's glow flickered, painting the yard in shades of amber and ash. Sam Houston, the stranger who'd stepped from the dusk, sat by that fire, his silhouette steady as he tended the flames. Maggie gripped the kettle of bean stew, its heat seeping through the cloth, and steeled herself to face him again. She crossed the yard, boots crunching on frost-kissed dirt, the air thick with the tang of sage and smoke. Sam looked up as she approached, his hat tipped back, revealing eyes that held the weight of miles. He'd built the fire neatly, logs stacked like a man who knew how to keep warmth from fleeing. "Set it here," Maggie said, placing the kettle on the crate, its iron base scarred from years of use. "Dipper's in the bucket. Cornbread's wrapped. Don't waste it." Sam nodded, his hands deliberate as he took a tin bowl, waiting until his mare snorted softly by the trough before serving himself. The stew steamed, its earthy scent mingling with the fire's crackle. Maggie stood back, arms crossed, watching him eat. Each spoonful was measured, no greed in his movements, just the quiet focus of a man who'd known lean days. The silver chain at his collar glinted again, the pendant still hidden, its shape pressing faintly against his shirt. It nagged at her, a detail out of place, like a hoofprint where no horse had walked. "You've been on the trail long?" she asked, voice low, probing. Sam's spoon paused, hovering over the bowl. "Long enough to know water's worth more than gold out here," he said, eyes flicking to the well's crooked frame. "This place yours alone?" Maggie's jaw tightened. Questions from strangers were traps, and she'd learned to sidestep them. "Mine to hold," she said, sharp enough to cut through the night's chill. "That's all you need to know." He nodded, no push in him, and took another bite, the firelight carving hollows in his cheeks. The windmill's blades creaked, a lonesome sound against the distant yip of a coyote. Maggie shifted, her apron brushing the crate. The tax notice's weight seemed to pull at her, whispering of the railroad men circling her spring like vultures over a kill. "You fix things," you said, she ventured, eyes narrowing. "What else are you good at besides pumps?" Sam set his bowl down, neat as a ledger, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Whatever needs doing. Fences, axles, roofs. I don't stay long enough to owe anybody." His words hung in the air, steady but guarded, like a man who'd built walls higher than any corral. Maggie caught the flicker of something in his gaze, regret, maybe, or a shadow of something left behind. She didn't press. Instead, She unwrapped the cornbread, breaking off a piece for herself. The crust crumbled, its warmth a small defiance against the cold. "Eat up," she said. "Barn's yours till dawn. Keep the lantern low. This place burns easily." Sam stood, brushing dust from his coat, and carried the empty bowl to the bucket, rinsing it with a splash of water from the trough. The mare nickered, nudging his shoulder, and he patted its flank with a gentleness that belied his rough edges. "Obliged, ma'am," he said, voice soft but sure. "Name's Maggie," she corrected, turning toward the house. The fire snapped behind her, its light dancing on the barn's weathered boards. As she reached the porch, the wind carried a low whistle from the plains, a sound that could have been the wind or something else. Riders, maybe, or the ghost of trouble stirring. Maggie paused, hand on the doorframe, glancing back. Sam was banking the fire, his movements precise, the pendant at his neck catching one last gleam before he tucked it away. The barn's lantern glowed faint, a single point of light in the vast dark. She stepped inside, the tax notice still heavy in her pocket, but the stranger's quiet competence left a crack in the silence she'd carried too long. Tomorrow might bring answers, or more questions. For now, the night held its secrets close, and so did she. Dawn broke over the Wyoming plain like a blade slicing through the dark, the first light spilling gold across the frost-dusted sagebrush. Maggie Carver stood on the porch, her breath clouding in the sharp air, the weight of the tax notice still tucked in her apron like a stone. The stranger, Sam Houston, had left the fire pit cold, its ashes scattered by the night's wind. His promise to fix things lingered in her mind, sharp as the glint of that silver pendant he kept hidden. She pulled her shawl tight, eyes scanning the yard for signs of trouble. Riders, surveyors, or the county's long shadow. The barn's lantern was out, but a faint clink of metal drew her gaze to the well. Sam was already there, crouched by the pump's rusted base, a wrench turning slow in his calloused hands. The windmill's blades spun lazy, catching the morning's first gusts, their creaks softer now, less like a dying beast. Maggie stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the brittle grass, the air thick with the scent of sage and damp earth. Sam didn't look up, his focus on the gears, each twist of the wrench deliberate, like a man coaxing life from something long neglected. His mare grazed nearby, tethered loose, her coat gleaming under the rising sun. The pendant at Sam's collar swayed as he worked, its shape still a mystery, but its presence a quiet taunt. "You're up early," Maggie said, voice carrying just enough edge to keep him at arm's length. Sam glanced her way, hat brim shading his eyes. "Dawn's the best time to fix what's broke," he said, tightening a bolt. "This pump's been fighting you too long." Maggie crossed her arms, watching him swap a worn washer for a new one from a small canvas pouch. His hands moved with the sureness of a farrier shoeing a horse, no wasted motion. "You carry spare parts for every ranch you stumble on?" she asked, her tone dry as the dust underfoot. Sam's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Just the ones that look like they're holding on by a thread." He stood, wiping his hands on a rag, and gestured to the pump handle. "Try it." Maggie hesitated, her fingers brushing the tax notice in her pocket. She stepped forward, gripped the handle, and pumped. The water came fast, a clear rush that sang through the pipe, steady as a heartbeat. The sound was richer than she'd heard in years, each surge promising life to the parched land. She let the handle rest, the silence heavy with the weight of what it meant. "Runs like it's new," she said, her voice betraying a flicker of surprise. Sam nodded, packing his tools. "It'll hold, long as the windmill don't quit." The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost, and the sagebrush gave up its sharp, clean scent. Maggie's eyes flicked to the horizon, where the road to Bitter Creek cut a faint line through the plain. The railroad's shadow loomed there, in the form of surveyors and tax collectors, hungry for her spring. Hooves thudded in the distance, steady and purposeful. Maggie tensed, hand drifting to her knife. Sam straightened, his gaze following hers. Sheriff Amos Reed rode into the yard, his bay gelding kicking up red dust that hung like a warning. His badge caught the light, cold and unyielding. "Morning, Maggie," he said, reining in, his eyes sliding to Sam. "County's talking. $40 due, or they take the spring. Railroad's got their eye on it." Maggie's fingers tightened on her apron. "They've wanted it since my husband's blood hit the ground," she said, voice low, hard. Reed's jaw worked, like he was chewing on words he didn't like. "They're saying you're behind. Papers filed yesterday." He pulled a folded document from his coat, the county seal stark against the paper. Maggie took it, her hand steady despite the fire in her chest. "This ain't right," she said, scanning the lines. Reed shrugged, his eyes flicking to Sam again. "Be careful who you let linger, Maggie. Some men bring trouble bigger than a busted pump." He tipped his hat and rode off, the dust settling slowly in his wake. Maggie folded the paper, tucking it beside the tax notice. Sam watched her, his expression unreadable, the pendant at his neck catching a stray beam of sunlight. "They're circling tight," he said, voice low. "They always do," Maggie replied, her gaze fixed on the road. The pump's steady drip echoed behind her, a small victory in a fight that was far from over. She turned toward the house, the weight of the papers heavier than the dawn's promise. But Sam's quiet work had shifted something in the air, something she wasn't ready to name. The Wyoming morning burned off the last wisps of dawn, leaving the plain stark under a sky wide enough to swallow hope whole. Maggie Carver stood by the house, the tax notice and Sheriff Reed's warning folded tight in her apron, their weight like lead in her chest. The pump's steady drip, now freed by Sam Houston's hands, echoed across the yard, a small defiance against the railroad's hunger for her spring. But the road to Bitter Creek still stretched ominous, a ribbon of dust promising trouble. As the sun climbed, Maggie grabbed 2 empty buckets, her boots cutting a path toward the spring, where the land's heart beat strongest. The creek ran clear, its banks fringed with brittle grass that whispered under the breeze. She stopped short, buckets clanging against her thighs. 2 men stood at the far bend, their clean coats and pressed trousers out of place against the Wyoming grit. One, gray-bearded and broad, drove survey stakes into the earth with slow, deliberate blows. The other, lean with pale eyes that didn't blink, held a transit, its brass gleaming like a vulture's gaze. A rolled map hung from his shoulder, red pencil marks bleeding through the canvas case. Maggie's grip tightened. "You're on my land," she said, voice flat as a rifle barrel. The bearded man looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Railroad survey, ma'am. State charter gives us 20 feet from the center line." His tone was polite, but his hammer kept moving. Maggie stepped closer, the bucket's handles biting into her palms. "That's my water you're staking." The pale-eyed man straightened, his smile thin as a blade. "We'll work around it. Tracks need grade, not your spring." His words carried the weight of men who answered to someone bigger. Before Maggie could reply, boots crunched behind her. Sam Houston appeared, his coat flapping in the wind, his hat low against the sun's glare. He didn't ask questions, just walked to the pale-eyed man and tapped the map case. "Unroll it," he said, voice low but carrying the bite of authority. The surveyor bristled, his hand hovering near the map. "And who are you to read it?" Sam's fingers moved to his collar, pulling free the silver pendant, a locomotive wheel engraved with Ashford and Continental. "Gideon Ashford," he said, the name landing like a stone in still water. This line's not crossing her spring. The surveyors froze, their eyes darting between Sam, Gideon, and the map. Maggie's breath caught, her mind reeling. The man who'd fixed her pump, eaten her stew, was no drifter. He was the railroad, or had been. "You're one of them," she said, voice sharp enough to cut leather. Gideon met her gaze, his eyes steady but heavy. "Was. I walked away from bad deals and worse men. I'm here to set things right." The bearded man shifted, uneasy, but the pale-eyed one unrolled the map across a crate, red lines curving tight around Maggie's spring. Gideon leaned over, his finger tracing the route. 3% grade on clay soil. Flanges'll scream, and the first flood'll take your bridge." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a man who'd seen tracks fail. The pale-eyed man's jaw tightened. "We've got orders." Gideon straightened, the pendant glinting in his hand. "Orders don't change dirt. Replot west, where the ground's rock and the grade's under 2. Or I ride to Sagebrush and have your foreman explain why he's wasting company coin." The surveyors exchanged a glance, the kind that passes when men know they're outranked. They gathered their stakes, retreating up the bank without a backward look. Maggie set her buckets down, the water's rush loud in the sudden quiet. "You lied," she said, stepping close, her eyes blazing. "You're the railroad, and you think I'll trust you now?" Gideon's face didn't flinch. "I'm a man who broke things, Maggie. Now I fix them. Starting here." She held his gaze, the springs murmur a steady pulse between them. "If you're spinning tales like this," she said, "you're part of something bigger than one woman's fight. Stick with us. Share this story. Tell us where you're listening from. It's voices like yours that keep the truth alive." The wind carried dust across the plain, and Maggie turned back to the spring, its flow unbroken. Gideon's shadow lingered beside her, his past a storm cloud on the horizon, promising either salvation or ruin. The Wyoming sun hung high, its heat pressing down on the plain like a branding iron. But Maggie Carver felt only the cold sting of betrayal. Gideon Ashford's words, "I'm here to set things right," echoed in her mind, sharp as the crack of a whip. She stood by the spring, its waters rushing clear, a lifeline the railroad coveted. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from fury, as she faced the man who'd hidden his past behind a drifter's dust. The surveyor's retreat had bought her time, but Gideon's revelation had cracked the fragile trust she'd begun to build. The spring's murmur was steady, but the storm brewing between them was anything but. Maggie's boots sank into the soft earth by the creek, her eyes locked on Gideon. "You built the railroad that's choking this land," she said, her voice low, cutting through the sage-scented air. "Every stake they drive, every spring they claim, that's your doing." Gideon's face was unreadable, his hat brim shading eyes that held a flicker of something raw. He slipped the silver pendant back beneath his collar, its locomotive wheel glinting briefly, a mark of the empire he'd fled. "I was part of it," he said, voice steady as bedrock. "Made choices that broke good people. I'm not that man anymore." She stepped closer, close enough to smell the leather of his coat and the faint tang of axle grease. "Then why come here? Why my land?" Her fingers brushed the tax notice in her apron, its words a noose tightening with each passing day. Gideon's gaze didn't waver. "I heard about a widow holding out against the line. Figured if I could help one person keep what's theirs, it might balance the scales." His words carried the weight of a man who'd carried guilt longer than his saddlebags. Before Maggie could answer, a low rumble broke the quiet. Hoofbeats, heavy and fast, coming up the Bitter Creek Road. 3 riders crested the rise, their silhouettes sharp against the noon glare. Dust swirled around them, and the glint of pistols at their hips marked them as ordinary hands. Railroad muscle, hired to scare or worse. The lead man, a scar-faced brute with a coat too clean for honest work, reined in hard, his horse snorting foam. "Carver," he growled, voice like gravel under a boot. "Time's up. Clear out, or we make you." Maggie's hand slid to her knife, but Gideon stepped forward, his frame loose but ready, like a wolf sizing up a fight. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. The scar-faced man laughed, a sound that grated like a rusted hinge. "And you're what? Her hired gun?" Gideon's hand rested near his belt, empty of a holster, but heavy with intent. "I'm the man telling you to ride back and tell your bosses the spring's off limits." The riders shifted, hands twitching toward their guns, but Gideon's stare held them like a pinned snake. The second man, wiry with a twitchy mustache, spoke low to the leader, and they exchanged a glance. "You'll regret this," the scar-faced man spat, wheeling his horse around. The trio rode off, dust trailing like a warning shot. Maggie's pulse hammered, her grip on the knife white-knuckled. "They'll be back," she said, turning to Gideon. "And you just painted a target on both of us." He nodded, brushing dirt from his hands. "Let 'em come. I've faced worse." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of old wounds, battles fought in boardrooms or on bloodied trails. Maggie couldn't tell. She crossed her arms, the spring's rush a steady pulse behind her. "You talk of balancing scales, but I don't know you. Not your name, not your sins. Why should I believe you won't sell me out when the price is right?" Gideon pulled his hat low, the pendant hidden once more. "You don't have to believe me. Believe the spring's still yours." He turned, walking toward the barn, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Maggie watched him go, the weight of the tax notice heavier than ever. The rider's threat hung in the air, and Gideon's past loomed larger still, a shadow cast long across her land. She knelt by the spring, dipping a hand in its cold flow, feeling the life it carried. The fight was far from over, and trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend lightly. The Wyoming dusk settled like a shroud, the sky bruising purple over the plain as Maggie Carver knelt by the spring, its cold water slipping through her fingers. Gideon Ashford's words, "Believe the spring's still yours," hung in the air, heavy as the dust kicked up by the railroad's hired guns. Their threat lingered, a promise of more men, more steel coming for her land. The tax notice in her apron burned hotter than the day's fading heat, but Gideon's stand against the riders had shifted something in her. Not trust, not yet, but a grudging spark of possibility. She stood, wiping her hands, and headed for the barn, where the lantern's glow cut through the gathering dark. Inside, the air smelled of hay and old leather, the mare's soft snorts punctuating the quiet. Gideon sat on a crate, sharpening a file against a rusted plow blade, his movements steady, like a man who'd learned to bide his time. Maggie stopped in the doorway, her shadow stretching long across the dirt floor. "Those men won't stop," she said, voice low, sharp as a spur. "They'll bring more next time. Guns, papers, whatever it takes." Gideon set the file down, his eyes meeting hers, steady but guarded. "Then we make sure they find nothing worth taking." He stood, pulling a folded map from his coat, its edges worn from use. Spreading it across a bale of hay, he traced a line west of the spring, where the ground hardened into basalt. "We move the water," he said, tapping the map. "Reroute the flow underground, through pipes. Surveyors won't see a spring worth claiming." Maggie leaned in, studying the crude sketch of her land. The idea was bold, reckless even, but it stirred something in her, a chance to fight without a blade. "And the county?" she asked. "They've got my name on a ledger, $40 I don't have." Gideon's jaw tightened, the silver pendant at his collar catching the lantern's flicker. "We muddy their books, too," he said. "Forge a deed, backdate it to show the springs on a parcel they can't touch. I know men in sagebrush who'll slip it past the clerks for a price." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about cheating the law." He met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm talking about keeping what's yours. The law's just a tool for men with deeper pockets." She paced the barn, boots stirring dust that danced in the light. The tax notice, the riders, the railroad's shadow. They were closing in like wolves on a wounded calf. Gideon's plan was a gamble, but so was standing still. "What's in it for you?" she asked, stopping short. "You don't strike me as a man who stays for nothing." Gideon's hand paused on the map, his voice low. "I've taken enough from folks like you. This is me paying a debt, even if it's late." The night deepened outside, the windmills creak a lonesome rhythm. Maggie nodded, not in agreement but in decision. "Show me," she said. Gideon led her to the spring, carrying a shovel and a coil of narrow pipe from the barn's stores. Under the starlight, they worked, digging a shallow trench to bury the pipe, redirecting the water's flow to a hidden outlet beneath a cluster of sagebrush. Each shovelful was a defiance, each clank of pipe a promise to hold the line. Gideon's hands, scarred and steady, moved with the precision of a man who'd built empires and watched them fall. By midnight, the pipe was laid, the spring's surface still, but its heart redirected, invisible to prying eyes. Maggie wiped sweat from her brow, the cold air biting her knuckles. "This'll fool them for a while," she said, "but they'll keep coming." Gideon drove a final stake to mark the pipe's path, his breath fogging in the chill. "Then we keep moving faster. Tomorrow, I'll ride to Sagebrush, get that deed filed." As they walked back to the barn, the plains stretched silent, the stars sharp as nails in the sky. Maggie glanced at Gideon, his silhouette etched against the dark, the weight of his past, a shadow she could almost see. The spring's secret was safe for now, but the fight was growing teeth. She clutched the tax notice in her pocket, its edges fraying, and felt the land beneath her boots, hers for as long as she could hold it. The Wyoming night held its breath, stars sharp as spurs over Maggie Carver's land, where the spring's hidden flow whispered of secrets buried deep. The forged deed, slipped into Sagebrush's records by Gideon Ashford's old contacts, was a fragile shield against the railroad's hunger. Maggie stood on the porch, the tax notice crumpled in her fist, its $40 demand, a noose she couldn't shake. Gideon's silhouette had vanished into the dark, riding for town to cement their plan. As dawn broke, painting the plain in streaks of fire, Maggie saddled her mare, the courthouse in Bitter Creek, calling her to a fight she couldn't dodge. The courthouse squatted on the edge of town, its brick walls peeling under the relentless sun, dust swirling through the street like a restless ghost. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat, benches packed with ranchers in stiff hats and merchants with folded arms. Maggie sat near the front, her calico dress patched but clean, her jaw set like iron. Gideon sat beside her, his coat brushed free of trail dust, the silver pendant tucked away, its weight a silent promise. The room buzzed, whispers of foreclosure and railroad schemes cutting through the morning's heat. Judge Clara Holt took the bench, her gavel cracking like a rifle shot. A wiry woman with eyes that missed nothing, she surveyed the crowd with the calm of a hawk before a dive. "Two matters today," she said, voice carrying over the murmurs. The Carver land foreclosure and the Ashford and Continental line through Bitter Creek. Boyle, the railroad's lawyer, rose, his black frock coat gleaming like a banker's promise. He held a sheaf of papers, his smile oiled and sharp. "Maggie Carver owes $40 in back taxes, Your Honor. Foreclosure's legal, notarized, and due." Maggie's fingers tightened on her skirt, the tax notice burning in her pocket. She'd seen men like Boyle before, smooth-talking vipers who'd sell a widow's land for a handful of coin. Before she could speak, Sheriff Amos Reed stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wood floor. "I've got evidence," he said, laying a ledger on the bench. County books were tampered. No debt on Carver's land, until the railroad leaned in 3 days ago. The crowd stirred, a low rumble like thunder on the plains. Boyle's face darkened, his papers trembling slightly. "That's slander," he snapped, voice high and brittle. Judge Holt's eyes narrowed, her thumb rubbing the ledger's ink. "Feels fresh to me," she said, setting it aside. "We'll settle that later. Next, the railroad." 3 boardmen in city suits shuffled forward, their rolled maps sweating under their arms. One unfurled a chart, its red lines tracing a path west of Maggie's spring, the route Gideon had forced. "Northern grade's safer," the boardman said, voice clipped. "Basalt Ridge, under 2%. Boyle shifted, his eyes darting to Gideon, who stood, slow and deliberate, his boots echoing in the hushed room. "I've got terms," Gideon said, laying a folded document on the bench. "Ashford and Continental runs the northern line. No water seized. Fair pay for every ranch crossed. And water stops every 15 miles, free to all." He slipped the silver pendant from his neck, its locomotive wheel glinting in the shaft of sunlight through the window. "My name's on it." The room went still, the air heavy as a storm's edge. Boyle's jaw worked, but no words came. The boardmen whispered, their faces pale, knowing the weight of Gideon Ashford's name. Judge Holt leaned forward, studying the document, her gavel resting like a loaded gun. "This is fairer than most railroad deals I've seen," she said, her voice steady. "But why trust you?" Gideon met her gaze. "Because I've seen what happens when lines run crooked. This one won't." The boardmen nodded, reluctant, but cornered. "We'll revise the charter," one muttered. Holt's gavel fell, sharp and final. "Foreclosure claims fraudulent. Carver's land stays hers. Railroad reroutes north." The crowd exhaled, a release like wind through sagebrush. Boyle stormed out, his coat flapping, brushing past ranchers without a glance. Maggie stood, her knees steady despite the fire in her chest. Gideon slid the pendant back on, its weight settling against his collar. Outside, the street shimmered with heat, dust settling slowly. Maggie glanced at him, the spring's safety a hard-won victory. But the cost of Gideon's past still loomed, a shadow cast long over the fight they'd won. For now. The Wyoming sun beat down on Bitter Creek, its light glinting off the courthouse's peeling bricks as Maggie Carver stepped into the street, the weight of victory settling uneasily in her bones. Gideon Ashford walked beside her, his silver pendant tucked away, its secrets now laid bare. The railroad's retreat and the judge's gavel had saved her spring, but the dust still swirled, carrying whispers of fights yet to come. Maggie's mare snorted at the hitch rail, and she mounted up, her eyes on the horizon where her land waited, its heart still beating beneath the sage. The ride back was silent, the plain stretching wide under a sky too vast for promises. By noon, the Carver Ranch came into view, the new water stop gleaming proud against the green rise of the spring. A freshly painted sign, Carver Spring in bold black letters, stood tall, its brass fittings catching the sun like polished spurs. The platform, timbered to keep hooves from churning mud, hummed with purpose. Maggie dismounted, her boots sinking into the earth, the air thick with the scent of wet sage and wildflowers. Gideon tethered his mare, his gaze sweeping the land, steady but searching, like a man measuring the cost of staying. A train's whistle pierced the quiet, its call carrying for miles across the plain. The locomotive rolled in from the west, its stack puffing white steam, iron wheels clanking slowly as it eased beside the water tower. Ranchers and townsfolk from Bitter Creek gathered, their hats low against the glare, kids perched on fences, their laughter sharp as the crack of a whip. The engineer, a burly man with a soot-streaked beard, swung down, checking the gauge with a practiced eye. Maggie approached the platform, her hand steady, watching the water surge through the pipe, filling the tender's tank in a hollow rush. Gideon stood nearby, his coat open, the pendant glinting faintly at his collar. "They'll keep coming," he said, voice low, eyes on the train. "Railroad never quits." Maggie nodded, her gaze fixed on the water's flow, its strength a testament to their fight. "Let 'em. This spring's mine." The engineer tipped his cap to her, a rare gesture in a world that rarely saw her. "Runs smoother than any stop I've seen, ma'am," he said, climbing back to the cab. The train's whistle blew again, and it pulled east, steel rails gleaming like a promise kept. The crowd drifted off, their wagons kicking up dust that hung in the warm air. Maggie turned to the house, where a new frame of pine stood by the kitchen door, pegs and braces marking the start of a small room. Gideon followed her gaze. "Building on?" she asked, her tone sharp but curious. He nodded, brushing a hand along the wood. "A man could sleep in town, but that's just walls. This feels like ground worth standing on." His words carried the weight of a life spent running, now tethered by something stronger than rope. Maggie's eyes searched his, the scars of his past etched in the lines of his face. "You're staying, then?" she asked, her voice softer, testing the air. Gideon looked to the spring, its waters catching the light like quicksilver. "Railroad'll call me away sometimes, but this place, it's more solid than anything I've known." He paused, his hand resting on the frame, the pendant still against his chest. Maggie felt the weight of her own years. Loss, fight, loneliness, ease just a fraction, like a knot loosening in a taut rope. The sun dipped low, painting the plain in hues of fire and shadow. Maggie walked to the porch, Gideon beside her, their steps matched in the quiet. The spring's murmur filled the yard, a steady pulse that spoke of endurance. She glanced at him, his silhouette sharp against the dying light, a man who'd carried the railroad's sins and chosen to stand against them. The land stretched before them, its edges softened by dusk, the tracks running true beyond the ridge. For the first time, Maggie saw not just survival, but a future carved from defiance, a spring that ran free, a home that held fast, and a fight that had forged something new between them. The Wyoming dusk fades, leaving Maggie's spring to murmur its defiance under the stars. Her fight, Gideon's redemption, and the land they saved speak to the heart of the West, where grit carves hope from dust. What did their stand stir in you? Share your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these tales alive. Gratitude for riding this trail with us, for standing by the fire as we spun this story. The plains hold more secrets, more souls forging paths through hardship. Keep your boots by the door, and we'll meet again when the next tale calls, carried on the wind like a distant train's whistle, promising stories worth hearing.